Thanks for joining us for another episode of Goin Ghostal Paranormal Investigators. This episode is entitled Laurelton Case Closed, a Joshy Cox original series in association with Masquerade Productions. I am your host, executive producer, and paranormal investigator, Joshy Cox. Be sure to like us, follow, and subscribe on all of our social media pages. Instagram.com, keyword Goin_Ghostal_paranormal. TikTok.com, keyword Goin Ghostal Paranormal. And YouTube.com, Goin Ghostal Paranormal. We hope you enjoy this all new episode of Goin Ghostal Paranormal Investigators, Laurelton Case Closed. From the time I was a small child, I always knew that I had a certain special sixth sense, I guess you could call it, but it was something I never put to practice. I never honed the craft because it was never really confirmed to me until years later. Once that had happened, well, I decided to mix that with my investigative skills that I already enjoyed as a hobby, if you will, and we decided to put together a group called Goin Ghostal Paranormal Investigators. And we ended up choosing Laurelton as our very first major paranormal investigation. And that was after some suggestions from friends and co-workers alike. And we went into it with very little knowledge. Just a few YouTube videos that we had watched about the village in Laurelton. I gained a little bit of background information, but not really much other than the fact of where Laurelton was, when it was built, and what it was about in terms of being a all-women's type of school or campus for several years until men were later integrated. So it left a lot of intrigue, but it also left a lot of questions unanswered. Of course, any state hospital, if you will, kind of makes people believe that there could definitely be a paranormal entity in that environment. So we decided that we would travel over to Laurelton, and after several trips to the campus, we picked up a lot of evidence that we gathered from on the inside, both spiritual, if you will, and as well as physical documentation that we were able to take some great photos of. And it did not take long before I realized there was a good bit of corruption, and there's also a lot of hauntings, for lack of better words. And that kind of leads many to wonder what is causing that kind of presence to remain this many years after a facility has closed, and especially one that was open for just so many years, such as Laurelton. So, we have done our due diligence. There was not as much available information online, but it's great because I was able to put my investigative work firsthand, and I made a lot of predictions, my own theories, if you will, of what I felt as though happened and what the main driving force of the Laurelton Center really was. And I'm coming to find out later that most of that all came to fruition. So sit back, and for you now just joining us for the first time, let's get a background information on Laurelton. Laurelton State Village started its life as a Laurelton Village for feeble-minded women of childbearing age. Being the first of its kind, the initial concept was intended to detain, segregate, and care for, as well as train feeble-minded women of childbearing age, usually between the ages of 16 and 45. Construction began in 1914 on 230 acres of land. First cottage opened in 1917 to its first 36 residents. Within the next 10 years, 6 more buildings were constructed, with the population increasing to 500 residents. The institution was self-sufficient, with residents working on the farm, harvesting the food, doing laundry, working in the kitchen, and in a bakery, as well as a cannery, a sewing factory, among others. Now, going back to its first initial concept intended to detain, segregate, then care for, and train feeble-minded women of childbearing age, I'm going to take a look at a story that was written by a certain author, and I think that will kind of open your eyes to a little bit more of what the real intentions were with a more obvious introduction. A grandmother's job inspires a story about asylums that denied motherhood to fertile women. American writer Anne Leary was digging through her family tree when she stumbled upon a very interesting, albeit uncomfortable fact about her grandmother. Although she was gainfully employed, which was an impressive feat for a teenage orphan in the 1930s, the gig was as a stenographer at Pennsylvania's Laurelton State Village for feeble-minded women of childbearing age. History books would love to ignore it, but not long ago, many such asylums existed across North America, and they were looking to lock up mentally or morally defective girls and women and who were considered to be unfit to be mothers. Worse still, the institutions were championed by famous feminist suffragettes who supported eugenics with the same enthusiasm they had for the women's vote. And if you're shocked and disturbed right now, just imagine how Leary must have felt when she discovered her personal connection, which she channeled into her fascinating new book called The Foundling. The family was about two girls raised in an orphanage who meet again as young women in the 1930s. Once as an inmate and the other as an employee of an institution for intellectually disabled women, run by supposedly admirable Dr. Vogel. Zuber called Leary in Connecticut to discuss fact versus fiction, hidden histories, and how she felt about her grandmother now. In The Foundling, Anne Leary explores the moral conundrum behind eugenics practiced by psychiatrists in the 1920s at an American home for the feeble-minded. One of the first questions asked was, did you ever consider writing this book in nonfiction form? To which Leary replied, oh yes, of course. I became very fascinated with the women who led the asylum suffragettes and one of the first female psychiatrists in the country. I thought the psychiatrist was amazing at first, which I'm sure my grandmother would have too, but like everyone, the doctor was of her time. And she was very flawed. I'm aware that she was a good person with a family and descendants, and I tried to be sensitive to them to fictionalize a character instead. Leary was asked, your main character, Mary, who was based on your grandmother, kind of waves in her support of the asylum's work. Talk to me about exploring this gray area. Leary responded, it's easy to make people either all good or evil, but that's not real life. When I found out that my grandmother worked at the Laurelton State Village, my first thought wasn't I was offended by the term, feeble-minded. Then I learned that was clinical terms, as was idiot and moron. I added an author's note afterwards to explain this because it could feel as though it could be jarring to come across those words in this context, but those were the official words she'd have used every day. The interviewer said, I suppose it's a lot harder just to write someone off. It's purely had when it's your own family. Leary answered, yes, exactly. And I had to put her into context too. My grandmother was an orphan who at age 17 had a great job as a secretary in a place that she probably truly believed helped women who were better off there than elsewhere. Some were criminals or prostitutes. Others were sent when they accused someone of rape or molestation, but some were just there because they were difficult and their husbands were sick of seeing them. I came across someone being admitted because they were actively seeking sex. These were so-called loose women, or basically me in college, Leary said. The host then said, it really describes everyone I know. We'd be sent away for sure. Leary responded, it is a very scary thought. We are depictions of the jazz age and Daisy Buchanan and Zelda Fitzgerald. We like to imagine it was the fun time of freedom and decadence. The truth is, it was a great time if you were rich. If you had no money, no status, well, if you were poor and did all the exact same things that the rich girls did, you were a nuisance to society. And because my grandmother was an orphan, I'd like to think that she'd be keenly aware that she could have been just as easily been an inmate rather than an employee. Creative liberty is pretty fun too, I must say. Leary said, I got to reimagine her as a sleek and glamorous, more of a villain and hypocrite. Actually, visited the facility too, which is abandoned now, but oddly beautiful, with the ballrooms and a gymnasium and indoor pool. It looks kind of like a college campus and a health spa, which, like my doctor character or eugenics itself, looks pretty on the outside until you dig a little bit deeper. I didn't learn about eugenics until the first year of women's studies at the university. This is one of those topics nobody tells you or talks about. And Larry replied, I'm in the States and I'm about to turn 60, so I didn't learn about eugenics until my daughter was in college and writing a paper on it. I didn't know anything about it at all. I find Canadians and the British are a little bit more aware, and I actually learned a lot from Canadian scholars while researching this book, but it's still a very specific time and topic that you need to really dig down for. But once I started researching, I was absolutely hooked. What do people not know about eugenics that you would want them to know? And Leary replied, it wasn't some fringe movement or hate group. It was the law of the land. It was widely accepted. It was considered a progressive science that would improve humanity by bettering the human race and preventing inferior stock from breeding. Famous feminists like Margaret Sanger are now taking lots of heat for this, but the ideology was elsewhere and everywhere. From Theodore Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, George Bernard Shaw, Alexander Graham Bell, all people who did lots of good things, but were all avid eugenicists. But check out Anne Leary's book, The Foundling, now. Now, this next piece was written by the West End Quarterly, and it really speaks to the time period of like the 1920s, 1930s, and in my opinion, looking back at what I know about history, the Green New Deal, the Great Depression, our government itself in America was really pushing socialism, which will lead to communism, while fighting communism, or that's what they were leading us to believe. But if you take a look at this, I think you will probably agree, and you'll see all the similar aspects that goes along with the eugenics and with the farming and the forced labor and trafficking of these women at Laurelton. The opening of the Laurelton State Village in 1920 was just one example of the ways in which people tried to help a rapidly changing society in the early 20th century. Politicians, civic leaders, and concerned citizens were outspoken about the need for social reform in the late 19th and early 20th century. Many reformers hoped to maintain social health by reaffirming appropriate social behavior and connecting inappropriate social behavior through religion, education, and institutionalization. The concern was a reflection of a much larger social and economical changes happening around the United States at the time period. And as the nation continued to invest in industrial expansion, not only men, but also women and children entered the workforce in large numbers. This disruption to traditional ways of life and growing concern for the detrimental effects of women and children entering the workforce led some advocates to devise creative methods of addressing the problem. This was an advertisement for the Laurelton State Village from many years ago, and we'll break that down for you and show you exactly how this fits right into what we were just discussing. Laurelton State Village, Union County. Feeble-minded women are the special charge of Laurelton State Village in Union County, East Central Pennsylvania. Notice they emphasize the feeble-minded women. Established by act of the 1913 state legislature, Laurelton Village today serves the entire Commonwealth in this important field of social welfare. It then says that its present population at the village is 903 patients, with 133 on parole. The Mental Health Act of 1923 changed the policies of the institution, making it a training school and permitting parole. The training program follows academic, industrial, and social lines. It then speaks about the splendid gymnasium, which was going unused in the 1945-46 school year due to a lack of a physical education teacher. But at the very bottom, then, it says training, moral, and social. And this was a huge propaganda piece. As you can see, they kept driving the feeble-minded and the social aspect of almost everything that they had slated. Explained in greater detail here, founders of the Laurelton State Village were inspired by these progressive measures of reform and carried these over into mental health facilities as well, with more women in the workforce and an increase in divorce rates and growing number of women living on their own. Some of the earliest candidates for institutionalization were often referred to as wayward girls. Before the Laurelton State Village opened its doors, similar institutions like the Illinois State Training School for delinquents, girls, institutionalized girls, and young women between the ages of 10 to 21 that were accused of crimes and or immorality. These early institutions became models for Pennsylvania's own institutions, especially the Laurelton State Village, where training and industrial reform became important elements to changing women's behavior. To this day, locals remember the village as a place for wayward girls, or a place where parents warned their children that bad girls were sent there to live. With access to their own income, divorce rates also began to rise, as did increasing concern in their personal behavior. Again, social reformers worried about what these changes would do to the future of the country, and new organizations began to appear to assist women's social behavior. I think it also had a lot to do with a certain short window or time frame of supreme profitability. Now back to the early days and how Laurelton became. The founders, the world during the time of the building of the Laurelton Center was in the midst of a big conflict, one of the largest of this time, as President Woodrow Wilson declared war against Germany in April of 1917, which was World War I. The women's suffrage movement was at its peak, and by 1919, women were actually given the right to vote. However, women were still a long way from being viewed as equal to men. As a Bucknell graduate, Dr. Mary Moore Wolfe traveled to Michigan to one of the only medical schools that accepted women. Once she returned to Pennsylvania, she spent her residency in the women's division at Norristown State Hospital, and seeing the treatment of the women led her to testify in court for the better judgment and protection of her girls. That's very key. Remember that point. Wolfe joined with other suffragists to establish the Women's Suffragette Party of Union County. Dr. Mary Wolfe had a vision, and she was determined to make Laurelton Village a place of, get this, rehabilitation and not permanent segregation. Remember these key terms. With her return to Hartley Township in 1913, Dr. Mary Wolfe fought the state politicians in remarks of opening a publicly funded establishment. In 1914, the construction began for the center and began on 230 acres of unbroken soil. The starting cost for the center was estimated to be about $380,000 in total for both construction and project costs. Dr. Mary Wolfe cared greatly about the care of patients with mental disabilities. That's how they were advertising this thing anyway. Again, a lot of propaganda in this one paragraph that you should remember. Dr. Mary Wolfe could not have done it all if not for her right-hand man, which was Dr. Oliver W.H. Glover. Without him, the village may have never been self-sufficient. Dr. Glover was on the lookout for some tillable property in the vicinity of the Laurelton Center. He ended up upraising $3,000 to be able to purchase 250 acres of land in the surrounding areas. He later donated the land to the village so that the girls could farm the land. This act of kindness got him on the board of trustees at the center. When he passed away in 1949, he was not forgotten and got a cottage named after him, now known as Glover Hall. As the long-living legacy of the Laurelton State Hospital tells us, well, girls in the beginning, Laurelton continued to build up throughout the roaring 20s of the Great Depression. During this time, attitude towards women changed considerably. People at this time could hardly afford to feed themselves, let alone any children, so families that were too poor would ultimately have their daughters sent to the village. The roaring 20s was a prime time for the cities, but not people from this rural part of Pennsylvania did not know much about it. Girls became flappers. It was not seen as uncommon for a woman to throw herself at you for money. So if you come back to the small state of Pennsylvania, women who worked the streets would obviously be sent to the village almost immediately. Women grew up watching their mothers and did not have money or schooling, so their mental capacity and IQ was usually lower than average, and the women in this area were conservative, so that if her husband had died and a neighbor's wife had died, maybe giving childbirth, then it was seen as proper for them to get married. Women could not fend for themselves, so they were usually required to have a man in their lives, and those people nearby were all they knew. anyone left behind would ultimately end up it being admitted to Laurelton. Adding to such efforts to have women admitted, the women to be placed in the center, a doctor would have to sign off saying that she lacked her mental capabilities. And almost any woman would have been placed into a facility such as Laurelton, since women were already seen as crazy during this time period. It was not until the 1950s when laws would change and would start to require multiple doctors signing off. So again, one doctor signing would be a very easy admittance. Girls that were taken off the streets, whether it be by law or whether it be by family, they normally did not enjoy their stay at Laurelton or the fact that they were being institutionalized. Girls that were coming here and seeking refuge from a bad experience at home, they often saw it as more of a retreat, but more often than not, many of the girls that were coming to Laurelton came because they were actually pregnant at the time. And that's what feeble-minded or wayward meant in many instances, were that they were just living a little bit more promiscuous lives than what some had hoped for them, and may have had a pregnancy out of wedlock, and that would find them institutionalized very quickly. Once that baby was born, then Laurelton would seek out the mother's family and ask them if they would want to accept the child and take care of that child. If the answer is no, or if Laurelton was unable to make contact with the family members, then they would, send them to a Catholic church privately, keyword being privately, where the baby would then be adopted out quietly. This confirmed one of my very first suspicions after visiting Laurelton for the first time in 2021, because my first theory was that this place was running some sort of an illegal adoption ring, because many of the state institutions actually had nurseries and playing areas where some of the women would actually take care of their own child while institutionalized. But Laurelton seemed to lack that. I also stumbled upon a chat room where people were asking for adoption records if they had known anything, because they had a grandparent that knew nothing about their upbringing. All they were told was that they were adopted out of Laurelton, but not a single record was ever found. So they had no clue as to what their family lineage or family tree may have consisted of. And that, again, led me to believe that there was some sort of a weird adoption taking place here. The Tony Shively history tells me that the village was practically self-sufficient when it came to food, that they were able to grow a large percentage of what was consumed at the institution. The tillable farmland surrounding the institution also provided a means of supplying food for the dairy herd, pigs, and other animals raised on state-owned land. In 1950, the institution was producing 50% of its food costs, while at the same time supplying other state institutions with their surplus. Wheat, corn, and oats were planted and harvested by use of their dairy operation. Vegetable and root crops such as potatoes, tomatoes, beans, carrots, and onions were grown on state land as well for use by the institution. In 1949, potato harvest was so bountiful that the Laurelton State Village shipped an estimated 200,000 pounds to other state institutions. In the 1950s, Bruce Folk was responsible for the dairy herd during his tenure at the village and was the recipient of awards for quality and production of milk produced by their herd. Harold Hackenberg was also in charge of the pig farm and butchering operations. The farm manager is J. Frank Snyder, and James Pollock was in charge of the truck garden. And it was estimated in 1951 that 90% of the girls in residence at Laurelton were able to perform some sort of labor. At the time of residence population was around 915 girls, with an additional 200 on parole. The cannery at the village employed nearly 55 to 60 girls, while the kitchen and bakery employed an additional 100. There was 120 girls employed in the fields and as groundskeepers, and 55 working in laundry. The girls were also instructed on how to do other routine work at the institution, which included the likes of sewing, cleaning, and the girls produced the majority of the clothing that they wore on a daily basis at the facility, as well as other facilities, and they also had sold baked goods and garments in other capacities, so there's revenue that was able to be brought in, which this again confirms yet a second theory of mine, that Laurelton was really set up in a way to bring in these feeble-minded or wayward girls in order to produce free labor. This is almost in a way human trafficking in a sense, because it's somewhat of an slavery encampment for free labor. Citing the West End Quarterly again, by the middle of the century, the Laurelton State Village was no longer just a center for segregation and reforming and rehabilitating women. It had also become a prominent research institution as well. Besides applying the latest research in the fields of mental health, well, the institution was a place where landscape and farming workers also applied a level of expertise to keep the village campus both beautiful and fruitful. Farming success was measured in numbers. Essential crops like wheat, corn, oats, potatoes were grown in large quantities. Workers and inmates also maintained a truck patch for growing smaller quantities of vegetables. Even dairy production at the village had reached impressive quantities by the middle of the century, and the farm often achieved Gold Seal certificate for cows, one of which produced 16,839 pounds of milk and nearly 4,000 pounds of butter fat. Once the previously spoken prominent male figures were brought in to head certain departments of the farm in the 1950s, the farm of the village was able to nourish and sustain inmates and employees at low cost, and by the middle of the century, the village farm was also producing more than it could consume. Surplus goods were then sent to other state hospitals and institutions. Annual reports detailed the growing success of that farming program. Charles McC. Snyder wrote, originally the Laurelton Feeble-Minded Home, later the Laurelton State Village, and more recently the Laurelton State School had been the largest employer in Hartley Township, absorbing some of the surplus of labor created by the demise of the lumbering era of the late 19th and early 20th century. But the retarded or feeble-minded had received little public attention until the study of psychology, a new social science, in the late 19th century came along to focus upon them. A theory that mental retardation was transmitted through heredity was popularized by the study of a Jukes family living in the backwoods of New York by Richard L. Dugdale. And the need, it seemed, was the separation of the retarded from society by sexes, and placing them in institutions where they could not breed. Those intelligent enough to receive instruction would be trained, and when too old to bear children, would be released in the care of families who would obtain their labor in return for supervision. And if that doesn't describe slave trade that occurred a century before, leading to the Civil War, then I don't know what is. Let's read that again. Those intelligent enough to receive instruction would be trained, and when too old to bear children, would be released in the care of families who would obtain their labor in return for supervision. But before any labor could take place, first the clients of the Laurelton State Hospital had to be placed into categories to determine if progression was even possible. Prolonged reasons that girls would be placed in the hospital for any extended period of time were for reasons known as epilepsy, blindness, mental illness, cardiacs, cripples, or just any individual considered low grade. The girls were placed into categories of psychopaths and psychotics. It was believed at the village that if someone was a psychopath, they cannot learn from experience, and periodically her bad behavior patterns will be repeated. The clients that were the problem girls in the cottages were thought to be psychopathic. Psychopaths were taken to Johnston Cottage for restraint or to be kept in their cottage for safe housing and separation from the outer society. The other category of psychotic residents were determined by a type of girl who needs understanding and training over a long period to substitute good habits for bad habits and social irresponsibilities. Psychotics were trained and took classes in the school to gain a better understanding of what it takes in certain tasks needed in life. The girls would be tested 2 to 3 times a year to see if they make progress and if they would move up the scale of idiots, imbeciles, low or high morons, borderline, dull, normal, or average. The girls worked daily, and the ones that were able to would switch jobs weekly. As residents stayed at the Laurelton State Village, they were given tasks based on what their skill level was. The jobs consisted of laundry, sewing, gardening, as we said before, cooking, baking, farming the land, canning, and many more. Some girls of lower capabilities had one job for the rest of their life or their stay at Laurelton. And as laws and regulations had changed, they changed the way that patients were cared for. Notice their wording changes from time to time from patients to inmates, but patients were cared for and how hard you could work them. That's very key there. Laws changed also as to patients and how long they were be isolated and were then around more outside people. Girls that worked in the earlier days were paid 50 cents, and that was to teach them about money, supposedly, and would allow them to treat themselves to sodas and candy at the canteen. During this period, people with disabilities were not allowed to be paid minimum wage. Now, by 1939, all buildings on the grounds had been completed and included a theater, recreation building, administration offices, 2 cottages, a powerhouse, and several buildings for hospital purposes. Within the administration building, they had a garage, a psychological laboratory, which I'm not understanding exactly what that would consist of, a post office, and various service and storage rooms. These are all located in the basement floor. So a psychological laboratory located in the basement floor of the administration building. The Laurelton Center ran multiple tests on their clients that stayed at the facility. One of their categories was hydrotherapy, and that was usually used to treat depression, headaches, stomach problems, joint and nerve pain, and other sorts of issues. Laurelton practiced their own form of hydrotherapy that consisted of wrapping their clients in towels and placing them in extremely cold water. Another weird practice was actually sterilization. Now, staff members at Laurelton claimed that did not take place. They did not sterilize humans in forms of tubal ligation with women and, of course, vasectomies once the men were incorporated and integrated into the system in 1969, although maps show that there is, in fact, a sterilization room listed within the Laurelton Hospital. And one other practice that they did definitely partake in, and that was admitted by Dr. Mary Wolfe, and that was the mixing of different medications, then giving them to the residents as they saw fit. And again, this was Dr. Mary Wolfe who stated that sometimes they would give the patients a quote-unquote little vacation to the hospital where they would give them sodium dilaudid and phenobarbital. That is a major opioid mixed with a major barbiturate. These drugs were given to people that were epileptic to control seizures, but they should never be given together in conjunction with one another. And this would typically cause the girls to pass out for very long periods of time, and this was a way of which they would control their behavior. Now, this sounds completely opposite from what Mary Wolfe had once said about she didn't want to see this as a prison system with harsh restrictions and lockdown measures. This was to be more of a rehabilitative and educational system, but that is not what this appears to be. And research suggests that this is not the only abuse type of scandal that has taken place. In fact, with any institution, there's always going to be some sort of controversial topic, but when it comes to Laurelton, they had a few scandals that cost some superintendents their jobs, and I do mean quite a few jobs. Some stories came out about the center that involved the mistreatment or abuse of those girls. In fact, in 1955, when the girls were being troublemakers or just disrespectful, they would bathe them in freezing cold water. There were also newspaper articles posted about the Johnston Cottage, a cottage where they claimed the most criminally insane individuals are kept. Reports surfaced that said the clients were being whipped by wet towels in the face after they had committed a rule infraction. Another lawsuit was filed against Laurelton because they were keeping one girl who was capable of going on parole, and it was just because the girl was such a good worker that Laurelton did not want to allow her to leave, and so they made her stay. A previous Laurelton company firefighter stated that they would randomly receive calls to come up to the Johnston Cottage, and when they would get there, the girls would be standing outside the building and lined up to be hosed by a tanker truck because they were being quote-unquote rowdy. Now, many scandals were not even publicized, as we will get into as we continue on with this conversation. Later, once the men arrived and entered the village, at least in terms of running the farm, that was around 1950, the women were no longer permitted to work on the farm because that was a man's job. There were 5 farms in total: dairy, a piggery, a hennery, and then you also had your truck garden and an orchard. Each farm grew a certain crop other than the garden and orchard. This was because the soil was different at each farm. However, all the vegetables and fruits were then sent to the cannery, and there they saved and preserved everything so that they could keep a helping supply. Over the years, the village had many expenses. And as time marched on, prices increased, so the state started to receive less and less money in terms of funding the state school. When the state finally decided that the institution could no longer work the clients to the same extent anymore, things went really downhill for the village, as the girls had nothing to do at all to spend their day, which many blamed on tripping their mental capacity. And then many of the girls, quote unquote, went insane. This thing giving, obviously, the state institution more and more reason to deny them the access to be replaced into the real world. Seen here is a picture of an honorary dinner honoring Dr. Ireland and Dr. Edgett for their many accomplishments as board members and on the staff of Laurelton, and what they've done for the village, being honored by the likes of the founder, Dr. Mary Wolfe, among other prominent figures such as a Toastmaster as well as a senator that were on hand to celebrate the pair's accomplishments. But the years of corruption and abuse were finally catching up, and the narratives were beginning to crumble. When the Laurelton State Village first opened, rehabilitative and educational training was secondary to the institution's goal of segregating and detaining inmates who could potentially reproduce, which completely goes against what the founder, Dr. Mary Wolfe's original stance or vision called for. Mental illness was thought to be hereditary, and keeping women of reproductive age institutionalized was one of the main goals of the village. But even in early studies conducted in the institution, there was little conclusive evidence that finds heredity links to feeble-mindedness. And in 1951, Dr. F.E. Ireland admitted that feeble-mindedness was a complicated trait, and said that there may be carriers of the afflicted who are not themselves defective, and therefore cannot be readily identified. Because of this, feeble-minded women are no longer segregated for the entire childbearing period. For Dr. Ireland and other experts in the field, it was becoming increasingly clear that environmental factors also contributed to delinquent behaviors. And according to Dr. Ireland, feeble-mindedness itself does not make a person delinquent. To this must be added poverty, as well as alcoholism, home neglect, the broken home, bad community influences such as gang affiliation and association, and slum sections, lack of training suited to their mental and manual abilities. Dr. Ireland concluded that society has also carried a share of blame for bad behavior for many of the inmates. Ireland also admitted that many of these women had already served time in prison and often came to Laurelton with a great deal of resentment after having already served time for criminal acts. Her comments suggest that after serving sentences in prison, many women were then institutionalized at Laurelton Center, perhaps at the suggestion of family or a court order. While men might have also committed similar crimes, there was an additional onus placed on women to always engage in good behavior and to make moral judgments. Anything less than this could result in not only jail time, but also institutionalization to evaluate one's mental health. It's funny how the narratives all begin to spin and around, and they come full circle. So now these women are no longer needed for the fruits of their labor. So abuses can now officially begin and take place on a more common ground, a more regular basis. They will, of course, continue to make revenue, but that will be on a research type of basis. Grants given to them by the National Institute of Health, the National Institute of Mental Health, as we see a grant application right here. But their abuses can also be part of those trials and research. And I'm able to provide plenty of examples of that, as well as you see here the effects of tranquilizers, meaning fluorescein, on intelligence and education in mental retardants. Here's another list that's signed off on by the head of all of the National Institute of Mental Health grants and head of psychology department for Laurelton at that time, and that is by Dr. Butler. And this is just a very long list of research projects, all given grants and paid for by National Institute of Mental Health at the Laurelton Village, or Laurelton Center, Laurelton State School and Hospital, were all receiving funding and profit from, and that was during the time period of 1958 to 1963. Which you can see recorded at the top, the header of this list, of course, the grants in the National Institute of Mental Health and the dates that are conjoined. And before long, the founder, which is Dr. Mary Wolfe, and her two stooges, Dr. Ireland and Dr. Edgett, well, their great reputations are about to come crashing down, and there's very good reason for such. Much of which has to do with events that had occurred at this building, the Johnston Cottage, which was built in 1952, and that was resident housing, and that again was where they kept some of the very worst or they claimed to have kept the very worst for solitary confinement. Particularly when there's headlines such as this that are coming out of a major newspaper out of Altoona. The concentration camp operation ended at Laurelton Village. Welfare Secretary Harry Shapiro said Friday a recent cleanup of conditions at Laurelton State Village for mental health clients in Union County ended a concentration camp operation. As far as I'm concerned, those dungeons in Johnston Cottage amounted to a concentration camp. He made the statement after Governor George M. Leader formally congratulated Shapiro for making public what he termed facts so abhorrent they need no embellishment from me, the governor said. Shapiro's move to eliminate what he described as conditions reminiscent of the Dark Ages already has brought a request for a Senate probe of Laurelton Village. On this point, Senator Roland B. Mahaney, Republican floor leader, said the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee would meet Monday to consider the probe demand made by Senator Samuel Wolfe of Union County and Robert T. Fleming of Allegheny County. This will not be an inquiry or inquisition against Shapiro, but an opportunity for both the Senate and the people who differ with him to air their grievances, Mahaney told a newsman. Shapiro, backed by the governor, showed the Newsman Institution records chronicling day-by-day incidents of shutting off water to inmates of solitary confinement cells in Johnston Cottage, punishing them for the rules infractions by slapping wet towels across their faces in similar incidents. Dr. Effie Ireland and Dr. Catherine Edgett, superintendent and assistant superintendent of the institution, respectively, have since resigned in protest of Shapiro's methods. Obviously, the barbarous treatment of the secretary had become an established pattern in an institution built and paid for by citizens of Pennsylvania to care for fellow Pennsylvanians afflicted as mentally deficient. Harry Shapiro destroyed that savage pattern. Both Governor Leader and Shapiro said their probes will continue at other state institutions. Leader, on this point, said, the dreadful possibility that conditions like those that Shapiro, found at Johnston Cottage might be duplicated in other institutions will haunt me until his work is completed. As other publications have since come out with even more horrifying accusations being alleged against the Laurelton Village. Patients kept in solitary confinement for as long as 6 months in 40 barred cells in Johnston Cottage, with each cell sealed by a solid wooden door that had only a peephole and a slot for feeding purposes. 6 months of solitary confinement. Using Johnston Cottage for punishment for rules infractions. Turning on cold water only once a day for washing purposes. No hot water, only cold water 1 time per day. Limiting meals to a piece of bread with just as much food as could be placed on the top of the one bread slice, and that is for an entire day. 1 slice of bread with just a little bit of food on the top. Turning off the water supply for a toilet for an entire week, no flushing whatsoever. Removing mattresses from beds and forcing patients to sleep on hard springs or on the floor. Beating and dragging a patient around by the hair, and restraining girls by strapping their arms together above their heads for as long as a week. No rest for their arm muscles, above their head for a week at a time through 6 months of solitary. And Shapiro said testimony on these conditions was provided by Mrs. Virginia Schneeberg of Mifflinburg, nursing director of the village, Miss Virginia Wilson of Milton, a nurse, and Mrs. Doris Marino of Lewisburg, a former social service worker at Laurelton Village. While it's unclear how many of the inmates in the cottage were a threat to the attendants, but Secretary Shapiro used his authority to make immediate changes while simultaneously gathering evidence to support his claims of cruelty at Laurelton. Shapiro ordered all 40 inmates in Johnston Cottage to be removed at once and ordered immediate changes to the cottage, including the removal of solid doors in each confined room to support his claim. Shapiro quickly recovered all records pertaining to Johnston Cottage, despite an employee working in the cottage removing these records, which is tampering with evidence, but Shapiro ordered their return. Shapiro sent 4 more state employees to investigate conditions at Laurelton and also obtained recorded statements from attendants and inmates that support his claims at Laurelton. And when Dr. Ireland and Dr. Edgett learned that Secretary Shapiro ordered the closing of Johnston Cottage, they protest by basically claiming that Shapiro's order would threaten the safety of both employees and inmates, and that the order to shut down the cottage would also place them in an impossible situation. The board members backed both Ireland and Edgett, but in protest of Shapiro's order to shut down the cottage, both Ireland and Edgett submitted letters of resignation to the board, although the board refused to recognize their resignations. Shapiro's claims of abuse and cruelty placed the Laurelton State Village at the center of a statewide scandal, and Shapiro collected enough evidence to support a story of disturbing charges against the institution. Working with an investigator and using the recovered records from the cottage, Shapiro also was able to go into further detail, more specific incidents of cruelty. Upon reviewing the records, both Dr. Edgett and Dr. Ireland stated that they were shocked at some of the contents. Dr. Edgett further stated that she would take whole responsibility for not visiting the cottage or reviewing the books more often. Despite the evidence collected that supported Shapiro's claims, some believed that the charges were still exaggerated. And that was Dr. Mary Wolfe, the founder and first supervisor to Laurelton State Village, who argued, quote, I think that Mr. Shapiro has shown by what he has said and done at Laurelton State Village that he is not fit to be Secretary of Welfare and doesn't know the first thing about mental institutions. Dr. Ireland was one of my assistants. She is a fine Christian woman, and I've never known Dr. Ireland to do anything wrong, unquote. They would all have their opportunity to testify and speak their minds and give their opinions, their thoughts, and their accounts, share their accounts and recollections of some of the things that had happened, and there were plenty of witnesses to provide such testimony when they had their day in court in Harrisburg as part of a Senate hearing. And, the results were they favored the Secretary of Welfare. And they certainly were not kidding when they said it cost a lot of superintendents some jobs. Well, it was more than just some. It was plenty of superintendent and other administrative staff's jobs that were lost and changed over the course of the years. In fact, I found myself laughing hysterically inside when Virginia Jean Schneeberg, the director of nursing, said that the superintendent was weak and the assistant was a sadist. There was a punishment S list during which no one talked to the individual being punished, and there were as many as 3 locked cottages at some point. And the revolving door just continued and continued as jobs continued to change hands at the very top. Of course, the original supervisor and superintendent, the founder of the Laurelton Village, Dr. Mary Wolfe, well, her claims were that everything was politically motivated, and that would cause that kind of abuse that there were eyewitness accounts of. It's very disgusting to think that she was a member of a suffragette group in fighting for women's rights, but yet she was the one who had no problems seeing the torture of her own kind. And just some of the crimes of cruelty and abuse that were being reported, again, as we once had heard before, that some of the scandals went unpublicized, it begs to differ now the question of legitimacy of this amount of escapees that you're seeing that are coming up on your screen. What else had happened that went unpublicized, that went untold, in terms of especially what would make this many people try to escape, especially if they were paroling as many as what they had said. And if the girls at that time, before men were integrated in 1969, if the girls were that happy and fulfilled by working, then why were some of these numbers before those time periods? And went on, of course, after as well. It is an insane amount of numbers that you're seeing here. And there's an obvious reason other than just trying to take the credibility away and saying that they were feeble-minded or wayward or mentally retarded for the reasons that they would want to leave this drastically, especially in such large numbers. It also brings into question some of the incidents and the deaths that had occurred. From those that were the hard-working class of feeble-minded or wayward women at Laurelton, those who were enjoying their teachings, their surroundings, the friends and the new family that they had made, the singing, the laughter, the infectious smiles. Not all were happy. Not all were tortured. But at one time, the good was little, and the evil became many, and the evil became mighty. Just seeing the list of investigations and the court case summaries will shed plenty of light on how the ideals and the enrichment, the entitlement of a select few will supersede any resemblance of remorse or the morality that they so spoke of when classifying patients who they then later declared as being inmates. It's easy to believe that many of the staff and employees at the Laurelton Village were innocent by their demeanor. And some may have even been naive. But for the crimes of this proportion, it's also hard to fathom that many are not implicated as well, especially over the course of so many years. Nearly 70 years in the making. Thousands of patients or inmates, residents, if you prefer. Hundreds of staff members, all playing strategic roles. For some, it was an abbreviated stay. Paroled out, many of whom did not return to family life, but they were sold to families in exchange for their labor. Many just longed for a true escape and a chance at redemption and to experience freedoms that had been taken from them from the first day that they had walked onto campus or out into the fields or the dining halls, the bakeries, the sewing factories, in the kitchens, the canneries, or the moment they were first confined in solitary confinement, left to their own solitude, strapped, detained, segregated, tapered off from the rest of the world and all civilization as they had ever dreamed of it to be. And now they are left behind. Many of their entities and energies remain. Stories to be told by the likes of you and I. This concludes our new episode, Goin Ghostal Paranormal Investigators. Laurelton Village. Case closed. Thanks for joining us. I'm your host and executive producer, Joshy Cox. This has been a Joshy Cox Films presentation. In association with Masquerade Productions. You can contact Goin Ghostal Paranormal Investigators at goinghostal@gmail.com. Again, that's goinghostal@gmail.com. Until next time, we are Goin Ghostal.